Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another edition of the Internet Governance Briefing. We are starting the new series in 2022. It's hard to get used to the new year already. And I hope you had some good beginning of the year and some days off at least, because it seems like that this year will, well, let's say again, be very dynamic when it comes to digital developments, policies, and events around the world. For those of you that might be new to the briefings, I'll just outline what we're going to talk about in the next half an hour, 45 minutes. Let's see how it goes. It's an unusual setting always for the January briefing, because we are trying to look ahead, look at what's going to happen in the next year. Sort of predictions. They're very hard to make, but we'll try our best with 10 predictions of what we think that 2022 will look like when it comes to digital developments. With us, I'll have a special guest, Jovan Kurbalija, Director of Diplo and Head of the Geneva Internet Platform, who has been following on these predictions year by year. So we might even reflect a little bit to what extent the previous predictions came through. But we want to open up hopefully a lot of time of this webinar and the meeting to you as well, and to some other friends and experts from Diplo to reflect on at least some of those predictions. So let's try to make it as interactive as we can. And to help us with that, we have my dear colleague Virginia Ginger Pak, who is going to play the role of the, well, chat moderator, but actually what we used to call online moderator, but what is online these days. So she'll help feeding the chat discussions into the main discussions, but I also encourage you to raise the hand if you want to jump in with voice and video at any point and give your thoughts and reflections and questions. By the way, for those of you that have been following the briefings in the previous months and years, you might know these elements of the IG barometer, where we measure the pressure of the internet governance developments, and then we announce the events that are coming next month. But we did a little change this time. We're not going to go through that because it's static content. Instead, we encourage you to visit the Digital Watch website, to download the barometer, look at the events, analyze the developments, and more importantly, subscribe to the newsletter, which gives you the snippets at the right moment of what's happening. Let me not take more time and dive straight into the discussion or the predictions of 2022. And I invite Jovan Kurbalija to join me on this virtual stage. Jovan, welcome. It's good to establish the link with Geneva again. I want to tease you to start with these 10 keywords. We see them in the scroll down, but you can run through them if you can in sort of a tweet-like form. Why did you choose which of those 10 terms and what do they signify? Jovan.
Thank you, Vlada. Hello to everybody, and it's great to see you in the new year for our traditional discussion predictions for the next year. And I'm celebrating 10 years of predictions. The first one was done exactly 10 years ago, 2012. And it is surprising how slow are changes in digital field. And every year we thought that would be decisive year, and then you realize that changes in digital policy and governance are happening with glacial speed, and probably for two main reasons. One is that governments have not been ready to play proactively, and the second reason was that many tech companies, which are quite powerful in this field, are keen to preserve status quo. Therefore, we may expect this year, like we expected the last 10 years, that it will be decisive year. But let me try to substantiate why this year could be a different. And as we know, giving predictions in this geopolitical environment, when we don't know if the major conflict will erupt tomorrow, is not the easiest job. But let's, with all of these caveats, let me go through these 10 keywords. One is the economic and political power. Therefore, there is a major redistribution of economic and political power with two key actors: tech companies becoming enormously powerful economically, comparable only to East Indian Company from the history. And governments are back, especially after the COVID crisis. They are realizing that they have something to say. And it's happening in Brussels, in Beijing, in Washington, D.C. Therefore, there are changes. Second is sovereignty. There is a push for digital sovereignty in different forms: data, digital, cyber sovereignty. But ultimately, governments are trying to regain jurisdiction over their territory and traditional and citizens, and in particular to limit the negative spillover that they may have from the integrated internet when it comes to misinformation, cybersecurity, and other tools. Motivations are different, but there is a strong push towards digital sovereignty by governments and increasingly by citizens and others, including the question of self-determination, which is pushed in Swiss digital foreign policy. Then complementary to sovereignty is digital interdependence. And here we come to the rather difficult decisions and trade-offs that we'll have to make. Digital interdependence contribute to well-being, to economic growth of societies worldwide. If it is endangered, as it can be, easily we may have pushback and we may have major financial, political, economic consequences and social for societies worldwide, starting from simple things like families communicating to each other via Skype, WhatsApp, and other tools being distributed all over the continents with big diasporas. For digital interdependence and sovereignty will be an interplay. Then we have strong push, especially in Geneva, for mainstreaming digital in international negotiation and multilateral diplomacy. The digital cyber is becoming smaller and smaller, and we will have at the end, instead of e-commerce or e-trade, we'll have just trade or commerce. Digital health will become just health. Cyber security will become just security, and that is huge trend, especially for diplomats, that they should be aware of mainstreaming digital into multilateral diplomacy. Fourth keywords, this was for the fifth is peace and security. Now we are moving to the three pillars of the UN sort of dynamics: peace and security, economic and development, human rights. In peace and security, there are some good news. Cyber detente has been picking up between Russia and US after the Geneva summit, Biden-Putin. We will see if it is going to keep the momentum, especially depending on broader geopolitical crises, in particular Ukraine crisis. But there are some good news. There are less and less reports on attacks, cyber attacks, and tension. Experts from Russia and the US are talking to each other. There are first arrests of cyber criminals, and that may have a spillover effect to the multilateral negotiations. In the field of economy and development, the main push will be on somehow managing enormous economic power of tech companies via antitrust, fiscal regulation, data, and other regulatory instruments. And it is happening in Brussels, which is one of the main digital regulatory hub, but also increasingly in Beijing and in Washington, DC, and capitals worldwide. That's going to be there. You will see in the document that you will see there are specificities on WTO e-commerce negotiation, OECD taxation, and antitrust rules. Seventh keyword is human rights in this trinity of the UN: peace and security, economy and development, and human rights. Here we'll have an interesting development. Biden administration put the question of values very prominently into their digital policy. We are going to see how it will be operationalized, but digital and values will start landing more and more at the discussions in the UN Human Rights Council and different other bodies dealing with human rights. That will be an interesting trend. There will be, or as eighth trend, as eighth keyword is open and openness. And that would be, I would say, unique input for today's discussion, because other trends are more or less well known: open-ended working groups, cybersecurity. Why openness is becoming interesting? For a long time, openness was, in a way, part of the global knowledge public good community, with some major applications like Linux really changing the global internet, but still being relatively marginal when it comes to major movers and shakers, tech companies, who were running mainly their proprietary software. Now, openness has been pushed by strong geopolitical and geoeconomic interest. US government is pushing for open source 5G networks. One of the reasons is that US companies has been lagging behind Huawei when it comes to this 5G technology. The similar dynamics we have in the open source or open design for microchips, and increasing pushes for interoperability and openness of data among tech companies. For example, Facebook pushing more and more Apple to be more open when it comes to data. Therefore, openness will be relatively high on the policy agenda in 2022 and in the coming years. Practically speaking, landing on the issues like standards, in a way, mainly open standards. And then we have two more specific predictions related to the modus operandi of global diplomacy. Centrality of hybrid meetings. Hybrid meetings are becoming new normal, and it opens all a set of new issues about protocol, engagement, technology, security, and an increasing use of AI and data for policy processes, from negotiations, policy planning, consular affairs, and generally engaging with the public. But those last two predictions, hybrid meetings and AI and data technology for diplomacy, are more modus operandi. They are not necessarily digital governance. They are predictions that about the way how global diplomacy will be shaped during 2022 and beyond, obviously. Over to you, Vlada.
Thank you, Jovan, and thanks for keeping it short and sweet, and then we can elaborate at least in some of those. I invite all of you to post your comments. I see there is quite an activity in chat already, and in a minute I'll invite Ginger to maybe run through the chat discussion, so please go on, and also raise a hand. If you want to jump in, comment, add your own prediction or reflect on one of them, just please raise the hand and we'll pass the mic back to you. Before that, I want to start, Jovan, with the interplay of the first few predictions that you mentioned, which are somehow, let's say, more general, but they are really connected. You start with the power and the question of redistribution of the power, and in a way, you know, the old adage from the movie, The Empire Strikes Back. So are we going to see, how does this power interplays with sovereignty on one hand, with interdependence on the other hand, because it seems that like they can't necessarily coexist, or can they? So do you see the so to speak, the waxing role of the state, the increasing role of the state, and where do you see that? Or actually it would be again the tech pushing back?
Well, Vlada, that's really a crucial issue. The tech companies are there are two aspects. First, tech companies are becoming so powerful in terms of their might, economic and I would say even political power, but also they're powerful because they are a part of the critical infrastructure of our society. Just think about country being disconnected from Facebook or Instagram or Twitter for one day. It may be healthy for especially youngsters, younger people, but it can create major political and economic instability. Therefore, they are intertwined into critical infrastructure of societies worldwide. Therefore, that power is enormous. On the other side, you have governments who are realizing during the COVID crisis that they have some obligations based on the social contract to deliver on public good, mainly related to health, but increasingly to deliver on public good on the digital predictability, reliance of citizens on digital networks. Therefore, they have some obligation and they are realizing that they have some power. This is a power of literally having jurisdiction over certain territory and people who are living on that territory. Now, how it will, what will be the interplay between these two dynamics is difficult to say, but we're seeing moves in Brussels traditionally, but also in Beijing and Washington, D.C. towards curbing the power of tech companies. Therefore, testing the power of each governments and tech companies started. The worst scenario, I would say, for democracy, inclusion, civil society, public good, would be if there are strange deals between these two powerful actors. And here is what really worries me. Civil society is relatively weak in these discussions. And when you compare civil society in the internet governance 10 or 20 years ago, it's much weaker today in cybersecurity and other discussions. That is going to be a major problem, to have a third actor who can help having pro-public good discussions and engagement. But there will be difficult decisions to be made. Countries can have a digital sovereignty over their data, but in the same time, they may lose economic business competitiveness. Companies can push for their views and ignore public policy, but it will hit back, as it has started happening with GDPR and other regulations. What is important is to have a clarity, not to camouflage discussion around nice narrative, blue sky narratives. It's good that we do what we should do. Companies to provide good services and make money, governments to protect the public good and interest of citizens, and hopefully civil society to make a bit of noise and to put all of these actors more accountable.
Thanks. It'll definitely be interesting to watch this sovereignty part, particularly in light of increasing tensions between some big parties as we see these days. But let me turn, I see there is a lot of discussion in the chat, a lot of reflections. Let me turn to Ginger now to see what's happening in the chat. And again, I invite you, if you wish to jump in and reflect briefly, feel free to raise a hand. Ginger, what's happening in the chat?
Well, the chat started very actively right from the beginning, and I'm going to go back to the beginning. People were caught up by Jovan's oxymoron of fast or slow, glacial speed. How can it be glacial speed? So Richard particularly mentioned that digital policy has hardly moved, but reality has changed very rapidly. If we also go back to the beginning, another way to ask this is who's in charge? Who are private companies or governments actually more representative of their citizens? And this relates to the points Jovan just brought in about civil society. Andrew asked whether this is the year when internet governance will break completely free from the flawed US frameworks and begin to tackle the many problems caused by the major platforms. The duty of care in the UK's online safety bill has promise in this regard, and ditto, the EU's DSA picking up issues with datafication and online ad targeting. Another question Nigel asked, would it be good to reflect also on work in New York and how the new tech envoy will affect this debate? Marilia brought in more points, speaking of technological convergence and control, saying, but the end game is beyond their influence. That's the source of our technology is running wild feeling, she believes, and others agreed with her. Patrick asked, do these keyword definitions predict greater tension between the multi-stakeholder model and the multilateral model of governance? And again, Jovan has already moved on to that question. And it's interesting to see that the chat paralleled Jovan's points with many mentioning the empire and power. So governments and civil society may be the contradiction we're going to be looking at. Again, I'm going to repeat Vlada's invitation to raise your hand if you'd like to make your point, or let me know in particular which points you would like to emphasize in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. Jovan, any brief reflections? Then I do have a sub-question to some other Diplo experts, but Jovan, any reflections?
Well, I completely agree with Richard that the changes are very slow, which is not necessarily bad, but the problem is when changes in policy do not follow changes in reality. We have example with the Section 230 of the US Defamation Speech Act, which was developed when internet was in the early stage, 1995, I think, but it is not anymore applicable today when internet is a critical infrastructure of modern society. Whether tech envoy is going to change dynamics, this is a special angle about the UN, what UN can do, and how UN can adjust to this. We have the question of special tech envoy, the question of IGF Plus, strengthening Internet Governance Forum. We have, but my guess will be that, you know, the famous John Lennon saying is the life is what happens while you're making big plans about life. I think the changes will start happening in multilateral organization, in digital health, in e-commerce, in humanitarian, in the other fields. These changes are completely underestimated, and they are going to have this impact on reality in different fields. In a way, traditional IG narratives are going to be either obsolete or relevant if they're fast adjusted, mainly through strengthening IGF and UN role in this field. But they are going to be sideshow as long as the caravans are moving through this major direction, mainly multilateral, when it comes to this negotiation. And I think Andrew Schwerer made one interesting, very relevant point. We have to be clarity. We have to have a clarity of discussion. It is fine to have involvement of different actors, but actors have different responsibilities. Governments have to deliver public good. They have to fix roads. They have to organize education. They have to provide health. If we as a society agree that it should be done by private tech companies, that has to be done explicitly. But you cannot have income of tech companies comparable to whole continent market capitalization of Apple, which is not the best way of comparing. There are some dilemma more than Africa's GDP. Therefore, we have to have a clear, frank, and open discussion. Maybe the society will decide, as it did with the Westphalia Treaty or during Axial Age 20 centuries ago, that governments shouldn't do it. I'm not of that opinion, but that debate must be clear, open, and frank. And I think UN provides UN Secretary General call for negotiating new social contracts for the future is important context. We have to discuss with the clarity what are our roles and what are our responsibilities. And I would say there are imbalances. Governments are expected to provide public good with less and less means. Taxation, OECD rules of taxation will rebalance it a bit by having more tax income from tech companies, but there are still major imbalances which are creating instability in the global society, national society, and ultimately everybody could be victim of that instability, including those who have the most power.
Thank you, Jovan. Ginger, you had a hand up. I guess there is some more interesting feeds or your own reflection. Ginger.
Yes, thank you. I just don't want the moment to pass because on the very point that Jovan is talking about and the balance and the need for civil society again, Andrew has asked, on the multi-stakeholder debate, some discussion groups are suggesting that civil society is increasingly being influenced and captured by the big tech companies. Is this a major concern here? Is multi-stakeholder still a possibility? And this, Jovan, I would love to hear what about the response. We talk about the roles and responsibilities of government, of public good, but what is civil society fulfilling its role and taking its responsibility seriously? And then just Yasmin had a question for you, Jovan, because we're making the predictions on a global level. She asks, do you have any regional predictions? How will different regions with their different level of development and public-private partnership models and integration levels likely cope with this fast-pacing digital reality and the changes in digital governance? Thank you.
Thanks, Ginger. Jovan, you can reflect immediately, and then I'll try to stream the two interesting discussions further. Jovan.
Good. On the question of civil society and the tech companies and governments, again, there is a need for clarity. Ideally, civil society should protect public interest. Public interest when it comes to the public goods of whether it is security, whether it is protection of human lives, human dignity, and all of or climate change and other climate and other public goods. Obviously, this could be theoretical concepts. We have a real people, a real organization, real life, real support, and that is one of the huge challenges ahead of us. Internet governance had a loose form of the multi-stakeholder involvement, not like climate change or sustainable development spaces, which had a more sort of a clearer, better organized multi-stakeholder involvement. My feeling is that civil society will have, in the internet field, will have to move in that direction because it is very, very diverse, from tech community, academia, activist organization, capacity development, local communities, and that is probably going to happen. Some sort of more clarity about the roles and interests of civil society in order to avoid them being basically representatives of either governments or private companies' interests. It will always happen, but it should be reduced with more clarity when it comes, including the question of funding and the other issues. Yasmin, this is an excellent comment. We try to make this a rather generic prediction, but it applies differently, including governments. Government of the United States and China are two only governments who have direct internal legal tools to enforce some regulation over companies. EU, Brussels, and other governments are trying to do it different means through GDPR, extended jurisdiction, and the other things. Therefore, that prediction have to be adjusted to specific context, regional, national, and even in the international Geneva. In international Geneva, main development is mainstreaming of digital discussions into international organizations, less than, let's say, geopolitical issues. What we are doing in the follow-up to this session, and you will be receiving links, we will try to mainstream also predictions to specific contexts. European, Geneva context, cybersecurity community, data community, AI community. You can imagine that all of those predictions can be developed further, and that would be great. I don't know where you're connecting from, Yasmin, but it would be great to have a collective work on this and see how this prediction look from the context of, let's say, Middle East or African continent or Latin America and other places, because there are the internet is similar or the same, but the impact of the internet is different on local societies and economy and socio-cultural dynamics.
Jovan, let me connect now to the two topics and actually put you aside for a moment and bring in two expert ladies, one after another from Diplo. Firstly, I want to bring in Stephanie, because you touched upon these means how states actually play with the private sector, work when it comes to antitrust measures or data protection and generally protection of the public good. Stephanie, you've been following these discussions for quite a while. Anything to add to what you can expect to see now in 2022 when it comes to this shift of power, if we wish, and sovereignty in that sense? Stephanie.
Thanks, Vlada. Well, not much. Jovan explained the shift, the struggle of power quite well. So nothing major to add. I think it would be interesting to observe how this dance, as Jovan explained it, is taking place across different continents. For instance, what we can see in the US, what we can see in the EU, what we can see in China. It's interesting to compare. For instance, on data protection, right? The EU has moved ahead with the GDPR. Probably it was easier for the EU to take to make a move there because there are, as such, no big homegrown industries like the US has. The US is obviously much slower because it has other interests to protect. And on the other hand, we see China moving ahead with legislation. Its data protection legislation was quite similar to the GDPR. This was released last year, but also on other fronts, on competition, content policy, there seems to be the same kind of dance. So the EU moving forward quite quickly. China also, it is about to release an update to the antitrust legislation, and in the US debating, luckily there is bipartisan support, but still a bit of a slower movement. So I think this comparative analysis between the regions, I think that would be interesting to observe.
Thank you, Stephanie. And again, I invite you to comment further in the chat or hand. And the other to focus on what Jovan mentioned was mainstreaming. With the question, since Katarina, you've been working a lot on the digital foreign policies and what are the main elements around the world when it comes to focusing on mainstreaming of discussions in diplomatic circles. The main question is not just whether cyberspace exists anymore, as Jovan mentioned, that everything has become real. There is no cybersecurity, but actually security, and no cyber online privacy, but actually privacy because it's flooded. But the other question is, what are the trends when it comes to countries around the world, including Africa or other places around the world, in terms of digital foreign policy, and do they see more inclusive, digital or cyber? One, but can you see the trend? How does it take off in other countries around the world in diplomatic circles? Does that signal mainstreaming as well? Katarina.
Thank you, Vlada. First of all, it's really good to be back and see everyone and have such a great start to the new year. So I think we have to zoom out a little bit in terms of digital foreign policy. So as you said, I've been working on digital foreign policy for quite some time now, and it's interesting to see how different countries deal with that issue in different ways. So we have 5 countries around the world who have dedicated digital foreign policy strategies: Australia, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. And the first strategies of these kind came out in 2017. And while each of these strategies has obviously a different focus, they all deal with digital in a kind of broad sense. So it's not just cybersecurity, it's a very integrated way. And the other thing to note is that we do have very different terminologies that we find in these digital foreign policy strategies. And if you look at foreign policy and digital, we do find different terminologies that are sometimes meaning the same thing, but using different words. So for example, in the Swiss strategy, we have this emphasis on digital. If you look at the Australian strategy, there's a much stronger emphasis on cyber. And what I found is that while cyber, for example, is traditionally associated with security questions, as in cybersecurity, these kind of strict distinctions are kind of getting softer and softer. And generally, there's also an indication that we have to deal with all issues digital, and I like using the term digital, e-commerce, data protection, cybersecurity, development in a kind of integrated way. I mean, it's an obvious point that we've made quite a number of times, to not think in silos. But if we start thinking in terms of foreign policy and foreign policy strategy, that point becomes very, very strong. We're now working on research in terms of digital foreign policy of African countries. And there, the same point needs emphasizing that if you start to think in terms of foreign policy, we start to think a lot more in terms of integrating all these different aspects and not just on, for example, cybersecurity. And then as we go further into the future, obviously, we might reach a point where we don't need to emphasize cyber and digital. But I think we're not quite there yet. I think the point where we are at now is the realization that really all these things have to come together in order to be effective in foreign policy, for example.
Thank you, Katarina. If I may add one of those impressions of what could come next, observing this convergence of the fora, those discussing more the cyber issues, particularly security, those discussing digital issues, particularly development, where there were a couple of recent studies, not least by the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, on how this sort of a transforming of discussions of cybersecurity into digital security to connect digital development and investments with security preconditions for that. Security as an enabler of development was quite an important one. And then we also see, for instance, in the OECD, discussions which are now not focusing necessarily on security of, let's say, digital security of products and so on. So I think we'll see more and more of this connection. Let me get back now to Ginger to see what we have in chat, and then afterwards one last round of question to Jovan. Ginger, what's up in the chat?
Well, actually, it's a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion, and I do invite everyone who possibly can to read the discussion in parallel, because it's impossible to bring such a rich and varied discussion into the actual meeting. We would need hours and hours. I'm going to go back a bit to David's question. What are real expectations for advancements in 2022 on digital and human rights in the internet and emerging tech governance? And this, well, as human rights is an underlying and overarching theme to all of our discussions, and one of the most important, perhaps we could discuss that or Jovan could give us some highlights on how we see human rights in the coming year. There has been an interesting discussion by many on the multi-stakeholder model, and then also different governmental influences on the situation. But I think we need to read the chat and summarize each of us later. But with that, we have so much going on with the multi-stakeholder model discussion that we have actually proposed to Kat that we have a debate sometime soon, on a monthly debate on the topic. So we will be in touch with you later, Kat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. And one idea is that we try month by month to actually explore more into certain thematical areas of the trends and generally what's happening with the focus. So I'm quite sure and positive that we'll have more discussions in the next months on multi-stakeholder model and human rights as well. Now, coming back to Jovan, with maybe the last chunk of the question of basically questions connecting human rights, or now focusing on human rights from a couple of different perspectives. One is this sovereignty and the role of the state, and maybe increasing dominance of the state. How would that impact human rights on both positive and negative? And the other one is the emerging technologies and the open concepts, open standards, openness of interoperability, and generally discussions on standards. How do you see all of that will actually impact human rights and let's say freedom of expression, also the role of other stakeholders and their involvement? Jovan.
Vlada, to answer your and David's question, on human rights will gain in momentum with different impacts on the overall digital dynamics, including the question of sovereignty, what you mentioned. But probably we can identify 4 major trends that will happen in human rights. The first one is overall push of the, let's say, Biden administration towards value-driven digital foreign policy. We were waiting before the Summit of Democracies for the proposal by Alliance for the Future of the Internet, but it didn't happen. There were some proposals that were leaked, but that is going to influence in the cross-cutting way, in the overall way, discussion on human rights. In Human Rights Council, most likely, more on the question of freedom of expression as it has been traditional focus of the United States. This is one trend. Second trend is a cross-cutting coverage of human rights, which would be, we can call it more EU's trend. European Union pushed for resolution in the Human Rights Council last year, and that will be happening. How the digital impacts the rights of people with disabilities, gender rights, women rights, and all set of the human rights, in addition to traditional one, freedom of expression and privacy. Those were 2 pillar rights that were covered. This is the second trend. Therefore, first is more US, the second is more EU trend, not exclusively. The third trend will be the growing interest in standardization and the emergence of the human rights and the human-centered issues in discussion on standards. Therefore, via digital, human rights will enter the standardization discussions on the Internet of Things, on data, and in particular artificial intelligence. And this is the fourth trend. Discussion on artificial intelligence, especially after UNESCO guiding principles, which were issued in November, AI will bring human rights in the sharper focus, whether through the ethics angle, which is more, let's say, Asian angle, or more human rights angle, which is more pushed by, for example, European Union. Therefore, 4 major trends. First, value-driven Biden policy and impact on human rights. Second, European Union cross-cutting coverage of the human rights. Third, human rights and standardization. And fourth, AI push for the human rights and other human-centered issues, including the future of humanity, when it comes to the developments of artificial intelligence. And back to your concrete question, Vlada, governments should be the major guarantor of the implementation of human rights. Very often, some practices of exercising sovereignty, especially with the internet shutdowns, are linked to the question of human rights. And most likely we will unfortunately more of that. And that's element where the question of sovereignty may go against the obligation that governments undertook by signing, for example, human rights conventions. That dynamics will be interesting to observe in the coming months. And I think it will unfortunately accelerate, and with the risk of further disintegration of the internet and fragmentation of splinternet.
Thanks, Jovan. Well, at least on one positive note, that we can hopefully expect a bit more of the push for human rights by the governments or in this power play, but let's see how that goes. And let me turn to Richard Hill now, because I see the hand is up, and thanks to this seating, I can now see actually who has the hand up. Richard, as always, thanks for breaking the ice. So the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm not going to say anything controversial for once. I just wanted to give some information to those people who don't follow the ITU that closely. They have a thing called Council Working Group on Internet International Public Policy Issues, which has typically just resulted in a standoff between, the US and the West, basically saying everything's fine, and Russia, China, and other countries, Arab countries and some developing countries saying, no, we have to change everything. And they never reach consensus. They did an open consultation this year on the impact of the internet on climate change, which was very good. I encourage everybody to read the input documents and the summary. And then they had to decide what would be the topic for the next open public consultation. UK and others proposed to focus on the issue of the language barrier and making the internet truly multi-language or more multi-language than it is now. There's been progress, but more needs to be done. Russia, supported by others, supported tackling some of what they considered to be the key issues: security, the role of states, etc. And there was no agreement whatsoever on which topic to take. And this is significant because the issue got pushed to Plenipotentiary Conference. So the Plenipotentiary Conference takes place in September, October. In my opinion, is sure to have very heavy and extensive discussions on what, if anything, the role of states is in discussing things like security, et cetera, within the ITU. I predict there will be no agreement, but it will lead to some heated discussion. So I just thought it was worth pointing that out to people. Thanks.
We cannot hear you.
Planipot and the competition for the Secretary General. So it is again in the forefront of discussions. I have Marilia's hand up. Marilia.
Thank you, Vlada. I actually thought that Richard was going to bring this point up because we were having an interesting discussion in the chat about that. But this will also be a very interesting year when it comes to the dynamics in the WTO and e-commerce negotiations. As we know, at the end of last year, there was a major breakthrough in discussions in the WTO when there was an approval of regulation on services on the domestic level. And there is questions on whether the same will happen to the GSI this year. The co-conveners of the GSI, which is the plurilateral process among a subset of WTO members who is discussing rules on e-commerce, which are much broader than what we normally understand as e-commerce. As we have been discussing in the chat, there has been an important forum shifting of different digital topics to e-commerce negotiations, such as network neutrality, privacy, cybersecurity, data flows, access to the source code of computer programs and algorithms. Therefore, if these negotiations actually move forward, this will be really interesting dynamics because the WTO for the latest years has been completely sidelined when it comes to norm making. Norm making is actually happening inside regional trade agreements, especially in the Asia Pacific, which is another interesting development. The US and Europe used to be the places that were the hubs of norm making when it comes to e-commerce and the digital economy. And this is no longer true. The center of gravity has definitely moved to the Asia Pacific and to countries such as Singapore, Australia, Japan, and China, who has been increasingly participating in regional trade agreements. And if the WTO manages to have a set of rules in that regard, it could come back to the center stage of e-commerce and digital economy negotiations and norm making. It's not clear if this will happen. Of course, digital issues are very complex. We have data flows on the agenda. However, it would be interesting to keep an eye on that. And I think that the biggest challenge is not actually to reach an agreement, but to reach an agreement that is balanced between the interests of developed and developing countries. There's a lot on stake. And as I was mentioning in the chat, I think that there's acute need to build capacity from developing countries to participate in these negotiations, so they are able either to stop some processes and issues that are not going to be in their interest, or to propose different legal solutions that will actually benefit development. We are starting to see that happening. There's a very interesting proposal on data flows that has been recently tabled by Nigeria, that has some proposals that would really benefit developing countries. However, this is not a general. There's still lack of developing country participation with rules, proposing rules, and this will be really interesting to watch these dynamics in the next year.
Thank you, Marilia. Well, if there is another bit that we can take from this, is not that just the topics and developments can surprise us this year, but also the fora where things are happening and how they impact beyond the thematic area that they're directly linked to. Thanks, Marilia, for that. I have one more hand up, so I'll pass the floor to Andrew, and with that I'll close the list of speakers and come back quickly to Jovan for final thought. Andrew, welcome. I think you're probably unmuted. Now it should be.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute. Apologies. Yeah. I mean, clearly, there's a lot of very interesting sort of points raised, and it feels like this year there's a lot of potential for positive developments in the areas of things like digital sovereignty, etc., etc. But are we in danger of having some interesting debates whilst the real action is happening in a combination of the trade agreements, so completely bypassing those interesting debates and just stuff being steamrolled through in bilateral trade negotiations on the one hand, and on the other hand, whilst all these sort of nuanced discussions are happening, stuff's happening in the various internet standards bodies which completely disregards the nuance and does what the libertarians wanted anyway. So I suppose I'm trying to provocatively ask, is this completely irrelevant, no matter how interesting it is?
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And we'll definitely have to get back to many of those topics throughout the year to expand further. Let me get back to Jovan now. Jovan, of course, you're most welcome to reflect on any of these issues raised, including Andrew's. But I do have another question where you can probably fit this in. And you started in a way with a sort of underlining that we are in the area of uncertainty, and that's certainly not surprising, right? But the question is, how do we get ready? And that means not just, diplomats, but any of the stakeholders involved in digital policy framing, business sector, technical community. How do we get ready? I know we have, as Diplo, and you've just started that. This master program and executive training on navigating the area of uncertainty, which seems to be quite interesting to many people. How do we navigate it? What are the skills? What should we do in that sense? Jovan.
Sure. Just a first comment on Andrew. This is very important to know and to be aware where real things are happening that ultimately can affect our daily practice or our daily life, how we use technology. Can we switch between social media like we cannot now, but maybe in the future we'll be able to switch like we can switch our mobile operators. That's important thing. This is not an abstract issue. This is an issue that impacts our daily reality. Like, I don't know, European Union call for the USB standardization body and Apple to follow the USB standards. That's in a way beauty of this and the risk that all of these discussions can impact our daily reality, even more than before. And this is a problem that we face in some bodies like Internet Governance Forum. I've been one of the founders of Internet Governance Forum. Discussions sometimes tend to be really dealing from reality. And this is one issue that we'll have to face sooner or later. Who is going to answer the calls of citizens, companies, and countries to address digital issues? Who is going to pick up the phone when it's ringing? From simple cybersecurity attacks to e-commerce, to human rights, to other issues. The first step is the clarity of discussion and clarity of intentions, not camouflaging in the nice narratives. We can have a nice narratives. We have to reduce we have to get to the reality and to have the open and frank discussions. Governments have different interests. Companies have their own interests, and how to reduce negative aspects of the risks and to enhance the positive aspects. That's the first point. We need the clarity of discussion. Second, to link to this is the clarity of language. Kat mentioned confusion about cyber digital diplomacy, tech diplomacy. And we understand it. Whenever somebody wants to make a new project, he has to add a different prefix. But it is cybersecurity, digital security, security tech, now metaverse security and other issues. But it's becoming risky because it takes time, it confuses debates, and it's basically increasing the overall instability of the global discussions. And third point, third and a half, is that we have to reduce lost in translation. There was discussion in the chat with David, the involvement of civil society and human rights civil society in standardization bodies. I attended a few sessions and I realized that tech people, tech experts got tired to explain what it is all about. And they basically just ignored human rights, who came from different rhetorics, different narration. Therefore, those boundary spanners, and I encourage young colleagues here to specialize in this, to develop skills to understand, to bridge different spaces. That's the third and half and 4 point. We will have to make difficult trade-offs, and that trade-offs should be made in informed, inclusive, and impactful way. Yes, we can have negotiation without participation of developing countries. That is happening, but it is not good for the future of the internet. It's not good for the inclusive economy. It's not good for e-commerce. We have to make a huge efforts, and Diplo has been doing it, for example, to bring the negotiators from the African continent, technical community, governments, diplomats, businesses, but in a substantive way, not as some sort of Ikebana multi-stakeholderism. It has been happening sometimes. Therefore, people who will reflect real interests of their societies, and they're often different than, let's say, interests of civil society in the developed world or in other parts of they're usually very local. Therefore, clarity of discussion, fairness, inclusion, respect, a bit of empathy, and the readiness to make difficult decisions and difficult trade-offs.
Thank you, Jovan, for this wrap up in a way, or actually opening up the topics for the entire year that we'll have to digest and dissect every month. What comes next? Well, out of the important events and developments, and we've mentioned just some of them in the WTO, in ITU, certainly in the UN First and Third Committee, discussions about cybersecurity. You can find all of that on the Digital Watch events page, and we'll be adding more and more. If we miss anything, please let us know, and then we'll add an important event to the Digital Watch. What comes next on our behalf as a Geneva Internet Platform, we have the annual Geneva Engage Award on the 1st of February. So make sure that you join us remotely, where we award the international Geneva actors for their outreach and the social media activity, online engagement. We have 3 categories for international organizations, for non-government organizations and communities, and for the permanent representations of the countries to the UN in Geneva. And it's important to mention that this year the award for the non-government organizations and communities will be dedicated to in memory of the internet pioneer Ian Peter, who passed away recently. When it comes to other elements of the briefing or the annual following, the barometer and the other visuals will be available on the Digital Watch. I encourage you to subscribe to the weekly and monthly newsletter, because you have all the details over there. And as of next month, we'll try to break this briefing into more bits and pieces like that, the newsletter, the podcast, hopefully the discussion like this on a particular topic at the end of the month. So stay tuned, and see you 1st of February for the Geneva Engage Award, and then the next briefing like this, 22nd of February this year. Stay tuned and stay healthy, and see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.